Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Baekdal Plus Podcast. In this episode, we are going to talk about curation, and it's based on the Plus report that I published last week. Now, when I say it's based on, I don't mean it's exactly the same. The problem I have with my Plus reports is that they are very visual in style, and there is no real good way for me to translate that into audio. So in this episode, we will talk about the same things and we will cover the same concepts, but it's not completely identical to the article. But let's get started and talk about the future of curation.
Where you at? Where you at now? Where you at? Where you at? Where you at now?
So, curation is something that is a bit hard to talk about because many people don't realize what it is. When people in the media world talk about curation, they're often talking about some kind of tech app that is pulling together links from all over the internet. But in reality, curation is something that is all around us. When you go to Facebook, everything you see there is basically a curated stream. It's not just curated because of Facebook and how they're using their algorithms, it's also curated because you as a person have picked out and chosen what it is that you want to follow. So Facebook is a curated stream. It's the same thing on Twitter, that is also a curated stream, and YouTube is a curated stream. But those are just the social channels. The thing is that every other channel is mostly curated as well. If you go to a magazine, almost every single magazine is a curated stream about whatever it is the magazine is about. So a gardening magazine is a curated stream of gardening articles where the journalists have gone out and they have looked at all the different things that was available in the world, picked out the things they thought was interesting, and then curated that into a magazine. It's the same thing with newspapers. Every single newspaper in the world is a curated stream of all the news that day. So curation is something that is everywhere. The future curation is not really about creating something we didn't have before. It's about rethinking the way we are already doing things. This is also where we find the first problem, because most of the curation that we are doing today doesn't actually work. And the reason why it doesn't work is because of limitations that we used to have. If you look at a newspaper before the internet and you look at how that was put together, you realize that the way newspapers are being put together, in other words, the way they're being curated, is not the most valuable way it could be. In the old days, we were limited by things like distribution and cost of getting things to the market. And because of that, every single newspaper is defined around creating this package of random news with a little bit for everyone. Now, I have talked about this about 1 million times before, but this is a really important thing to understand. The concept of a traditional newspaper has never been about creating personal relevance. Instead, it was about creating a package that could reach as wide an audience as possible. Now, from a point of curation, this isn't actually that valuable, because what you get is a product with just a little bit of everything and without a clear target audience. This was useful in the old days when we didn't have any other choice. But in the digital world, this form of curation doesn't really have that much of a value. And because of this, the value that newspapers bring in terms of curation is one of the lowest forms that we have, because pretty much any other form of curation would be better. Now, this also illustrates another problem we have with newspapers. If you look at 5 different newspapers in the world and you look at what type of stories they cover and how they're covering it, you find that every single newspaper are basically doing the same thing. There is almost no difference between them. And this is really important when it comes to curation, because if you try to curate newspapers, what you get is the same thing as what you started out with. We can see this if you turn to a news app like Flipboard. If you go to Flipboard and you look at the curated newsfeed that they offer, what you will get is a bunch of random stories, mostly politically focused, about things that are happening in the world. And these stories are curated from a bunch of different newspapers. But if you then go to just the New York Times and you look at their feed, what you get is exactly the same thing. Again, you get a bunch of random stories, mostly with a political focus, and mostly from around the world. So the difference between reading the curated stream from Flipboard and reading just the New York Times is pretty much the same. You didn't actually learn anything new. The curated stream from Flipboard did not change the value of the news or make it more useful or make it more relevant to you. It was just the same random stories, except now you're just getting it from different newspapers. And this is the problem that we see all the time when it comes to news curation. We start with a random product and we end with a random product. And somehow, people in the media industry think this is valuable, but in reality, we are just going around in circles. We are not creating anything new, we are not improving the news experience in any way, and we are not changing the product. So in order to talk about the future of curation, what we actually need is something entirely different. We need to stop thinking about it as just taking links from different places and putting them together, because that doesn't really do anything. What we need to do is we need to design a curated experience to solve more specific problems. So let's talk about what those can be. Ask yourself this simple question. What would be the most valuable form of curation that you can have? Well, the answer is that it's a combination of several different things. A great curated experience is something that is both personally relevant and focused, and at the same time ties into whatever context that people are in. You also want to make sure that your curation ties into the right type of moment, because moments is something that drives everything in the digital world. If people are just looking for something in the morning, you want to create a moment that fits into that. Whereas if people are sitting at work and they need some specific information, well, that is a different moment. So curating for the right moment is absolutely essential. One example of this is to think about something like a review. If you wanted to create a type of curation around creating reviews, how would you make that relevant? Well, one thing you could do would be to just list all the products that were available, and then you would call that a curated stream. This is essentially what Amazon is doing. If you go to Amazon and search for something like a water bottle, you will get something like 10,000 different results. And that is, in a sense, a curated view. But it's also not a very useful view, because unless you know what you're looking for, seeing about 10,000 different water bottles is not really going to help you. So to create truly valuable curation, you need to take that a step further. And you need to think about what is it that people really want in any given situation. And if people want a water bottle, maybe a better solution would be to do what the Wirecutter is doing. Now, if you go to the Wirecutter and you search for water bottles, what you will find is one of the best reviews on the internet. They reviewed 79 different water bottles. Yes, 79 different ones. But of those, they only picked out 5. And those are then what they recommend to you, telling you why they picked each one. This is essentially a great way to think about curation, because what they are doing is that they are combining all the things that makes curation valuable. They take a specific context, they focus in on what that context is about, they try to relate that to something that is personally relevant to you, but most importantly, they help you pick something. So this is what a curated stream should do. It should help you pick something that is relevant, focused, and contextually aware in relation to you. think about this in relation to any other type of media product. How would you focus that so that it was valuable to people? How would you make it more personally relevant? How would you make it more interesting? How would you make it more useful? How would you design for a better context? How would you focus it better? And how would you design that specific moment? This is the key element of curation. You have to constantly think about these things and just make that the best thing possible. Now, when it comes to news, we have an added complication. And the added complication is that the value of news is very, very different depending on what it is that you cover. So think about news in relation to how much of an impact it has on any specific person. The problem we have today is that most news that you see in newspapers do not actually have any form of personal impact at all. Let me give you a simple example. Take a news story like the ongoing discussions between the United States and North Korea. We might all say that this is a very important news story, and in many ways I agree. For society as a whole, or rather for the planet as a whole, it is an important story. But now think about it in relation to any individual person. Think about yourself, for instance. How much an impact does this story have on you? Well, the answer to that depends on where you are. If you are living in South Korea, you might feel that it has a deep impact on your personal life. Whereas if you, like me, live in Europe, it's mostly just something in the abstract. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think this story is important, but it doesn't change anything in relation to my personal life. So, a story like this is a bit weird because it feels important and I would like to know what it's about, but I can't actually do anything with it. And because of that, the value of this news is incredibly low. So if you ask me what would be the best format for this type of news for me, my answer would be something that could give me an extremely efficient summary about what was going on so that I could learn what was happening without really spending any time on it. But look at how the media is doing this today. If you go to some of the big newspapers, you will see almost daily coverage of this story, and it's not very efficient. Instead of giving me the news and instead of giving me something that is truly valuable to me, what most newspapers do today is they kind of give me a reality show instead of news. Because of this, we are now seeing a very interesting trend in terms of curation, because many of the new curation services that are coming out are all focusing on giving people news, but in a much more efficient way. One example of this is to look at a curation startup like Compass News. What Compass News is doing is that they are taking the stories from all the big newspapers and then they are curating that into very short 30-second summaries. In other words, they are giving me the news in a far more efficient format. Now, this format works great for all the news that I would like to know about, but doesn't really have any personal relevance. So news stories like the ongoing discussion between the United States and North Korea works great in this format because in just 30 seconds, I can get the big picture overview instead of having to waste my time reading all these stories that we see in traditional media. It's the same with almost every other form of news story. And when you look at the younger generation, we see this to an even greater extent. Now, many people say that young people just don't have any attention span, but that's not really what's happening. What is really happening is that the younger audience have been brought up in a world where they have so much information about so many things that they simply can't cope with it. But it's not that they don't care, just that there's just too much of it and they need something more efficient in order to be able to process it. So what young people are doing today is that they're basically separating news into two different categories. One category is all the generalized news that they can't really do anything with, but is still important to know about. And for these types of news stories, what the younger audience demands is an insanely efficient format, like what Compass News is providing, where instead of having to read a daily newspaper, you can just get what is essentially an executive summary. And all the generalized news fits into this hyper-efficient category. Then the second category is for all the news that is personally relevant for them. And this news is something that they will spend more time on. This is the trend that we see today. So the trend that we're seeing around young people and curation is that young people are managing their time. They don't just sit down and read a random package of news like their parents did. They are separating news into personally relevant and not personally relevant. And this is really the key to understanding this form of curation. Now, Compass News is not the only one doing this. We also see this trend with many other types of services. For instance, Axios fits into the same type of category, except that they don't really focus on young people as much as they focus on executives. And executives have the same type of focus. For their day-to-day news consumption, they don't want random articles that doesn't really get into the details. They want something that is extremely efficient. Axios is essentially doing the same thing. They have a very quick summary, and then they have a button called Why This Matters, where you can expand the story to get a slightly longer version of what is going on. But even the longer version is still just a hyper-condensed summary of the story. From a traditional news perspective, this new format seems shallow and weird, but what is really happening is that we are making the news more efficient. And if we look at the trends, this focus on creating efficient news is going to be a bigger and bigger part of the future. Now, mind you, curation is not just about making things shorter. It's really about making things more valuable. So whenever people have a deeper interest in something, curation also comes into effect. I want to give you an example. Think back to the last time there was a terror attack and think about how the newspapers covered that. Did that coverage help you understand what was going on, or did it leave you confused about all these different things that was happening? Well, in most cases, news coverage in relation to any form of crisis is usually extremely messy, and as a reader, you don't really get that much valuable information. What we could do is that we could turn to curation to pull together news and data from all different places in order to give people a kind of big picture overview of what was really going on. I wrote about this all the way back in 2013 in an article called News as Data and the Future of Newspapers. In this article, I used the example of a train accident in Spain, and I created a concept page that illustrated what such a curated page could look like. On this page, I had a number of different elements. There was a short summary, similar to what you would get from Axios at the top. Then there was a box of factual data. And then finally, there was deeper links to other types of information, like links to official statements or links to deeper analysis and insights that might have been provided. Now, this page was just a very simple one, and we could do so much more with it. But the concept here is that we need something that can give people that big picture, instead of what we see today, where it's mostly just a reality show. And curation can be a really powerful way of doing that. A terror accident is not really the best example of this. I'm just using it here because it's a very simple way to illustrate the concept. So a much better example is to think about something that is happening every single day. One example is business news. Instead of just giving people a very quick summary of the latest headlines in a 30-second format, there are many examples of business information where people need a bigger perspective. In the industry, this is called business intelligence. So think about curation in terms of business intelligence. Could you create a curated stream designed to create business intelligence for your premium subscribers? Well, for one thing, instead of giving people random selections of news, what you would do instead is to give people data. So imagine if you created a new service for business executives where every single day you would create a type of macro moment around data and trends and very important movements in the industry. This service would not be designed to just give you a bunch of random stories. Instead, it would be designed to help you learn. In fact, that is a pretty good name for it. Imagine that you created a macro moment curated stream called What We Learned Today. That would be an amazing thing to offer to your premium subscribers. So this is the future of curation. It's not about just giving people a filtered view of all the things that happens to be in a topic. Instead, it's about creating services, something that achieves a specific goal, something that helps your audience in a very specific way. So don't think about curation services like the thing you see with services like Flipboard. Those types of curation is basically meaningless. Think about it in terms of what you see with Axios or what you see with Wirecutter or data services like Statista. These services provide you with a far more specific view for something that is relevant to a specific situation. So this is the future of curation. The key here is to design something for the moments that you create and to create specific value and usefulness for your target audience. It's not just one thing, and it's definitely not just about showing a bunch of links that are filtered based on some form of engagement. It's about creating something far more specific that fits into what people need at different times. Don't just give people what they already have. Do something more. So this is the end of the second episode of Baekdal Plus. I hope you liked the way I converted one of my Plus articles into something that would work for audio. Now, obviously, I'm still learning how to do this, so if you have any comments or any feedback, don't hesitate to hit me up on my email or reach out to me on Twitter. I would love to hear from you. And also, if you like this podcast, please tell your friends about it and get them to subscribe to Baekdal Plus. And as always, thank you for listening.
That we are done.